There are moments in history so bizarre, so painful, that they sound like fiction. But this is no myth. This is the true story of a Roman boy named Sporus, taken from his home, robbed of his body, and forced to become a replacement for a dead woman the emperor could not let go. In the heart of ancient Rome, where emperors were gods, human lives were toys, and the greatest empire in the world was ruled by a man named Nero, a man known for fire, madness, and cruelty. This is not a story of power. It is a story of obsession, of identity, of a boy who became a ghost of someone else. Sporus was born into a world where names didn't always matter. No one wrote of his family. No one saved a portrait or inscription. He was likely a slave, young, quiet, and obedient. A child with soft features, delicate voice, and little power. He may have been born around 49 AD, as Rome was at its height, a city of marble, chaos, and ambition. Emperors came and went, but one name soon loomed over all others: Nero Claudius Caesar. While Nero rose through cruelty and bloodshed, Sporus remained in the shadows, a palace servant, a forgotten face. But history has a strange way of choosing its victims, and Sporus would soon be chosen, not for greatness, but for a role no one should ever be forced to play. She was the most powerful woman in Rome, Poppaea Sabina, wife of Emperor Nero, famous for her beauty, ambition, and charm. But her legacy ended in a scream. In the year 65 AD, while pregnant with Nero's child, Poppaea argued with him. Sources say it was about something small, a quarrel in the night. But Nero, known for his violent temper, kicked her in the belly. She collapsed, bleeding, and within hours she and the unborn child were dead. Nero was devastated, or so he claimed. Some said he mourned not out of love, but out of guilt. Others believed he truly adored her, in his twisted way. But instead of letting her go, he chose to replace her. Not with a new wife, not with a noblewoman, but with a boy named Sporus. Sporus was young, perhaps 14. He had no family, no title. He was at the mercy of the emperor, and that mercy was terrifying. Nero had him taken, and in secret he was castrated, stripped of his manhood so that he would not grow into a man. Why? Because Nero believed Sporus resembled Poppaea. With surgery complete, Sporus was dressed in the former empress's robes. He was given her jewelry, made to speak like her, walk like her, act like her. Nero called him Poppaea in public. He paraded him through Rome, even held a public wedding ceremony, where Nero married Sporus as his bride. The people whispered. The Senate watched in horror, but no one stopped it. The most powerful man in the world was living with a boy he had turned into his dead wife. The wedding was no rumor. Nero arranged an official ceremony. He wore the traditional groom's toga. Sporus, now renamed Poppaea, wore a bridal veil. Witnesses were forced to attend. Gold was spent, wine poured, laughter echoed through the halls, but no one dared to show discomfort. The Roman elite watched as the emperor kissed his boy bride. As they processed through the streets in a chariot, with Sporus waving like a real empress. To question Nero was to question a god. So they clapped, smiled, and swallowed their disgust. Behind closed doors, the palace was quiet. Sporus was not a wife. He was a prisoner in silk. He lived in Nero's chambers, slept at his side, and was made to perform the role of Poppaea, night after night, for an emperor haunted by what he had destroyed. Some say Sporus cried every night. Others say he learned to smile. But his voice never reached the histories. Only silence. The emperor of Rome had everything: power, wealth, a city of marble. And now, a boy wife dressed as a ghost from his past. But Nero's mind was unraveling. He saw enemies everywhere. He accused senators of treason, artists of conspiracy, even family of betrayal. He built a golden palace, Domus Aurea, lavish with ivory ceilings and mechanical fountains, while Rome's people starved. And then came the fire. In 64 AD, a great blaze consumed much of Rome. The city burned for 6 days. And while people fled, Nero, they said, stood watching, playing music as flames rose. When blame fell on him, he deflected it toward the Christians, a new sect in the empire. He had them arrested, tortured, and executed in public. Some were sewn into animal skins and torn apart by dogs. Others were crucified and set on fire to light Nero's gardens at night. Through it all, Sporus remained by his side, silent, decorated, alone. By the year 68 AD, Rome was restless. The Senate, the people, even Nero's own guards, had begun to turn against him. His reign, once dazzling with gold and fear, now seemed foolish, wasteful, and cruel. Revolts broke out in the provinces. Generals declared themselves rulers, and the mighty Praetorian Guard, Nero's personal protectors, abandoned him. The Senate declared him an enemy of the state. Nero fled the palace with only a few loyal men, including Sporus. They hid in a villa on the outskirts of Rome. No more silk, no more musicians, only silence. Knowing capture meant torture, Nero made a decision. He would take his own life, but couldn't do it alone. "What an artist dies in me," he reportedly said. And then, with the help of a servant, he plunged a dagger into his throat. The last emperor of the Julio-Claudian line was dead. Rome breathed again, and Sporus was left behind, a boy whose master was gone, but whose role as Poppaea was far from over. When Nero died, the empire did not fall silent. It fell into chaos. In the year 69 AD, four emperors would rise and fall, each clawing for the throne. It would be called the Year of the Four Emperors. And somehow, Sporus remained in the palace. He was passed along, from one powerful man to another. Otho, one of Nero's former friends and now emperor, took Sporus for himself. Some say he did it to honor Nero. Others say he was simply fascinated by Sporus's beauty and tragedy. Again, Sporus wore the empress's robes. Again, he was made to play a role, not as himself, but as someone else's obsession. When Otho died by suicide just months later, Sporus was once again claimed, this time by Vitellius, the next emperor. Vitellius was cruel, and though he didn't marry Sporus, he found amusement in the boy's tragic tale. He planned a public mock wedding in the arena. Sporus would be forced to stand before a crowd and relive the horror of his past as a joke. But Sporus refused to be mocked again. He found a knife and took his own life before the day arrived. He was no older than 20. Sporus left no writings, no statues, no tomb. His name appears only in the shadows of other men's stories, a footnote in the biographies of emperors. But his life speaks louder than marble, because it was not a story of greatness, but a story of control, of what happens when power goes unchecked, when love becomes obsession, when people are turned into props for the broken fantasies of rulers. Sporus was not an empress, not a rebel, not a saint. He was a boy, soft-spoken, obedient, and trapped inside the role someone else wrote for him. His story has been ignored, twisted, even mocked. But when you listen quietly, beneath the roar of emperors and the clash of armies, you can still hear him, walking the marbled halls, wearing another person's face, longing to be seen as himself. History often blames Nero for many things, and rightly so, but one of the strangest parts of his rule wasn't the fire or the murders. It was what came after Poppaea's death. Nero couldn't let her go. He ordered her body embalmed in spices and sealed in a white marble tomb. He had statues of her built across Rome. And then he looked for a replacement. That's when Sporus was chosen. He was never picked for love. He was picked for memory, to become a ghost. Poppaea's face, body, voice. Nero wasn't in love with Sporus. He was in love with the past, with guilt, with control. So he dressed the boy like a woman, gave him jewels and robes, and forced him to carry the weight of a woman he had killed. In every kiss, Nero kissed a ghost. In every touch, he tried to forget his own crime. And Sporus became the living shadow of a dead empress. In every empire, roles are assigned: soldier, senator, slave. But Sporus was given no choice. He was told, "You are no longer a boy. You are Poppaea now." His body was changed, his voice reshaped, his identity rewritten. No one asked what he wanted. No one asked who he was. And slowly, even Sporus may have forgotten the sound of his own name. The court clapped when he entered. They smiled at the emperor's side. But behind closed doors they whispered, "That's not a woman. That's not love." Sporus became a mask, a symbol, a thing. He wore dresses sewn with pearls, walked with grace, held Nero's hand in public. But inside, he was still just a child, wounded, afraid, and utterly alone. Not a ruler, not a rebel, just a boy, pretending to be a ghost. Rome was once proud, a republic, a land of laws and legions. But by the time Sporus walked its marble halls, the empire had rotted from within. Nero's madness, Sporus's humiliation, the murders, the feasts, the gold ceilings, They weren't just personal tragedies. They were signs. Signs that Rome had forgotten its roots. That power now belonged to the cruelest, to those who rewrote truth and called their fantasy reality. The people of Rome watched in silence as Sporus was paraded through the streets. Some pitied him, some laughed, but most said nothing, because in the empire of Nero, truth was dangerous, and silence was survival. Sporus became more than a person. He became a symbol of how far Rome had fallen, of how the line between theater and government had disappeared. An empire that once raised philosophers and generals now celebrated a mock bride, made from pain and fear, and no one stopped it. After Nero's death, Sporus could have disappeared. He could have slipped into the shadows, changed his name, tried to live free, but that was never allowed. He was claimed, not adopted, not protected, by the next emperor, Vitellius. Vitellius didn't love Sporus. He didn't even want him as a wife. He wanted him as a joke, a spectacle. He planned a grand event in the arena. Crowds would cheer, music would play, and in the center, Sporus, dressed once more as Poppaea, would be married again, not out of grief, not out of power, but out of mockery. It would be a theatrical humiliation, with Sporus paraded before thousands, to relive the very trauma that had ruined his life. It was to be a public performance of private pain, but Sporus refused. The night before the spectacle, he took a knife and ended the role they forced upon him. He died in silence, alone, no friends, no family. His name was Sporus, a name whispered in ancient texts, buried between the lines of emperors' stories. But in life, that name was almost never used. He was called Poppaea by Nero, by the court, by Rome. They erased his voice. They stole his body. They changed his name. And when he died, no monument was built, no tombstone carved. His name vanished into the marble dust of forgotten palaces. What survives is not his words, but what was done to him. Historians mention him only in footnotes, as if he were just an oddity, a curiosity, an ornament of a madman's court. But when you stop and really listen, you see more than a name. You see a child who wanted to live, to breathe, to belong, a human being, trapped in someone else's fantasy. And though they tried to erase him, his story remains, a quiet reminder that even in the shadow of an empire, some voices still echo. Rome was built on masks, statues, costumes, performances. In the theater and in the throne room, emperors wore crowns, but many were actors, pretending to be gods, pretending to love, pretending to rule with justice. Sporus wore a mask too, but his wasn't golden. It was made of silence. He was turned into a symbol, a performance, a tool, a reflection of someone else's grief. And still, he bowed, he walked, he smiled. His life was a tragedy, not just because of what happened to him, but because no one stopped it. Everyone saw. No one intervened. That is what power does. When left unchecked, it twists the innocent into living masks for the guilty. Rome called itself eternal, but inside its golden temples lived a truth darker than marble could hide. That in the shadow of every empire is a name like Sporus, a name whispered, not remembered. He was born into a world that didn't listen, a world that saw his beauty, but not his pain. His name was Sporus, and though history barely spoke it, he lived, he suffered, he mattered. He was not a ruler, not a general, not a philosopher. He was a boy forced into a role he never chose, turned into a ghost of a woman who had died, to comfort the man who killed her. He wore silk robes stitched in gold, but they were not gifts, they were chains. His tragedy was not just personal, it was systemic, it was human, it was empire. And though he died young, though his story was mocked, though his name was nearly lost, we remember him, because in remembering Sporus, we remember every silent voice, every forgotten life, every soul twisted by the hands of power. The empire fell, the emperors are dust, but his story, his real story, still breathes, in the quiet, in the dark, where truth waits for someone to listen.